Hello, let's try this again because the last time I did it, my internet seemed to have kicked me off. So, welcome everybody to Module 2, and I hope that you guys found that the first section was interesting. I hope you found that it was informative, kind of cool, and that, hopefully the exam was just right and not too difficult or too easy. Although I'm sure you would probably want to caution with the side of too easy. But um, in case you're wondering why we skipped from chapter 2 straight to chapter 6, this chapter is called Sensation and Perception. And it's a natural transition, in my opinion, because we just learned about neurons and how they communicate with neurotransmitters. And we talked about the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. And in this chapter, since you just learned about that, plus the parts of the brain and the lobes where things are interpreted or where information goes to be processed, it is a natural transition in my eyes to skip to chapter 6 and talk about the five senses: touch, taste, hearing, vision, and smell, and how they get to the brain and how we use that information for the brain to make sense of basically our outside world. So we're going to do this in 3 sections. Today, right now, this morning, whenever you're listening to this, is the basic concepts of sensation and perception, and I will try to give as much detail as I can without being too detailed, of course. In the second lecture, which is a little bit longer, it's the visual system specifically that seems to be the most complex, maybe. It's the one that the book concentrates on the most. So you'll talk about, or you'll listen to me talk about, the visual system from a sensation and perception processing standpoint. And then the third chapter was all about the non-visual senses, meaning they'll spend a little extra time on the auditory system and then touch up upon the touch system and taste and smell, the chemical senses. But today, or right now, we are going to go over this first part, which is the basic concepts of sensation and perception. It comes with some definitions. I'll give some examples from the book and from my own personal examples. And there are some videos to accompany it that you can watch afterwards. So from chapter 2 and neurons and communication, we go straight into chapter 6 before coming back to chapter 3, which is consciousness, sleep and dreams, and drugs and addiction, since they change your level of consciousness. But let's go now to the concepts of sensation and perception. You may have heard the terms sensation and perception before, but maybe you don't know necessarily exactly how they are different and how they are common. So sensation and perception, as the slide says, are actually parts of one continuous process. You go from one to the other, and the sum total of them is basically how we make sense of our world. So sensation is the first one, and you can think of sensation as the individual pieces of information about our outside world. So everything that we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell. And it's how they go up through those neurons we called sensory neurons. Remember, we have 3 types of neurons from chapter 2. And these sensory neurons take the information up from the outside world, from our eyes, our ears, our skin, nose, tongue, right? The 5 senses, and bring them up to our brain to interpret and process what we sense in our world. So you can see from the slide that this says it's a bottom-up process, which means it goes from the bottom, from outside the brain, and it goes up to the brain. But there's another reason that we use the term bottom-up process, and I'll give you that in just a sec. So let's read the rest of this. Bottom-up process by which the physical sensory system receives and represents stimuli at the very basic level of sensory receptors and works its way up. It works its way up in two different ways. Literally, it's going up to your brain. And the second way that we say that it works its way up is that it's basically your neurons that are giving little pieces of information about every single piece of that sensation. So what does that mean? Well, think about when you're looking at something. Let's say you're looking at a picture. There's different colors, there's different shapes, there may be brighter and dimmer, right? Brighter and darker colors. There may be straight lines, curved lines, jagged lines, right? All of that stuff. So basically, those little individual pieces of information that make up the entire picture are making their way up these sensory neurons and going to your brain. Because, spoiler alert, we don't see, hear, taste, touch, or smell anything until the brain gets a hold of it. So the bottom-up process you can think of like little individual puzzle pieces. So each little shape, each little color, each little piece of information is going up through these sensory neurons, right? Action potentials and chemicals, neurotransmitters, things like that. And it's making its way to that part of the brain that we talked about in chapter 2 that interprets the information. So visual information is going to that occipital lobe. Auditory information to the temporal lobe, information about touch to the parietal lobe, and of course, taste and smell underneath the front, at the bottom of the frontal lobe. So you can think of these little individual bottom-up sensory stimuli like puzzle pieces. The puzzle pieces are individually sent up towards the brain, and then when they get to the brain, then the puzzle pieces are basically put together almost instantaneously within milliseconds to give the actual full description of what it is you're seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, and feeling. So think of it when we say bottom up, like taking the puzzle pieces, sending them up to the brain, and the brain puts the puzzle together almost instantly. That is the process of sensation. Perception, and you may have heard the term perception is reality. We'll go over what that means in a bit. But perception is basically your interpretation of those things that your brain puts together. So you have the individual bottom-up process, the puzzle pieces that are going up to the brain in sensation. Once the puzzle is basically put together, that's not the end of it. Then it becomes what we call a top-down process. So the puzzle is put together, but what that puzzle means, and specifically what it means to you, is dependent on, and your brain compares it to, your experiences, your expectations, your thoughts, your motivations, and of course your memories. So what that means is the sensation tells you what it is that you're sensing, but perception is what gives it its meaning or what it means to you. So when we use the term perception is reality, what that means is how you based on your own experiences, your own expectations, and your own memories, etc. So many people can see the same thing, but interpret it or perceive it differently. And I'll give you an example in a second. So just to hit the point home, that sensation is the bottom-up processing. That is a sensory analysis. It begins at the entry level. It begins with those neurons that are first getting the signal. And I must say that it is a physical signal from the outside world that is getting interpreted, right? So in this sense, you're getting light waves that go to the visual system and go to the occipital lobe of the brain. So information is flowing from the sensory neurons and sensory receptors to the brain. Now, one thing we learned in chapter 2 that is a little bit different from here is we talked about neural receptors in chapter 2. The receptor, if you recall, when the chemical was released into the synapse, the receptors were like the little locks that picked up the key. The neurotransmitters were the key, so only the right one fit in the right lock, right? So dopamine to a dopamine receptor, acetylcholine to an acetylcholine receptor, serotonin to a serotonin receptor, et cetera, et cetera. When we talk about sensory receptors here, we're going to talk about the receptor a little bit differently with the same idea. So I'll get to that in a few minutes. So the bottom-up processing, again, is like the individual little puzzle pieces, and the information goes up through the sensory receptors, through the thalamus, except for the sense of smell, and up to the part of the brain where it is processed. Once that picture is put together, the top-down processing is guided by higher-level mental processes, as when we construct perceptions by filtering that information, comparing that picture or that thing, something we hear, something we smell, something we taste, through our experience and our expectations, memories, and things like that. So my example for you is, let's say that there's a few of us and we're at the park, hopefully practicing social distancing and being respectful. And let's just say that you guys are with me at the park, and all of a sudden we hear a noise. Ruff, ruff, ruff. The noise sounds the same to all of us, okay? We look over and we see something that is brownish with fur, 4 legs and a tail, maybe some floppy ears. Okay, that tells us something, gives us some information. And then maybe we're close enough to smell the thing. And you know, it smells pretty much like what we'd expect it to smell like. So based on our bottom-up sensory processing, our sensory analysis, what we're seeing looks like what we'd call a dog. What we're hearing, ruff, 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 sounds like a dog. And what we're smelling smells like what we know a dog to smell like. So based on all 3 of these things, all 3 of the 5 senses, we are pretty sure that we can identify this as a dog. That's the bottom-up part. What we see is pretty much the same. What we hear is pretty much the same. What we smell is pretty much the same. But how we interpret that, our sensation, now we're at the top-down part. We put the puzzle pieces together from those 3 systems: visual system, auditory system, smell, which is sometimes called olfactory or olfaction. Don't worry, you don't need to know that. And pretty much that tells all of us this is a dog. But how we interpret this information, what we do with this, may be different depending on our experiences and our expectations, our memories, and things like that. So for me, I grew up, when I was born, my family had a dog. I've been a dog person, had a dog almost my entire life, except for maybe a few years here and there when I lived in apartments. But even then, most of that time, my family had a dog. So I am what you call a dog person. I have a 13-and-a-half-year-old, half German Shepherd, half something small and scared, maybe half scaredy cat. We're not really sure what she's mixed with, but she's the sweetest, sweetest dog I've ever had, and just the best. Old lady now. But based on all of that, my perception, right, my experiences, my expectations, my memories of dogs, I see the dog, I smell the dog, I hear the dog, and my reaction, my interpretation of that is, oh, it's a dog. I want to go see if I can pet it, while still trying to be, again, respectful and distant. But I really want to pet and play with that dog, because that's my perception of dogs. Now, somebody standing next to me may, maybe a cat person, or maybe don't really care for dogs at all. Or maybe they even have an allergy to dogs. So while they're not averse to dogs, they don't want to walk the other way. They see the dog, they hear the dog, they smell the dog, and they say, oh, it's a dog. Whatever. And they just ignore it, right? That's a different perception of a dog than I have, because mine is based on different experiences, different expectations, different memories. And let's say that somebody's standing next to us and they see the dog, hear the dog, and smell the dog. And maybe when they were little, they got bit by a dog or chased by a dog. And so every time they hear a dog bark, maybe they get a little bit scared. That's their experience. That's their expectation, is dogs are scary. So their perception is, I don't want to be anywhere near a dog. So they see the dog, they smell the dog, they hear the dog, and their first reaction is, I'm going to go the other way. Bye. Right? They don't want to have anything to do with the dog or be anywhere near it. So that's where we get the idea that our perception is our reality. We can see, hear, and smell, taste, and touch all of the same things, but they may be completely different to us based on our experiences, expectations, preferences. While we can hear the same music from the same band, and some of us will gravitate towards that music and say, I love this band with all my heart. And some will say, you know, this is something I could dance to, but I could take or leave it. And some will say, this is garbage, right? I don't want to hear this. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about perception of reality in today's world with the problems that we're having in the country today. When we talk about things like, and I'm going to be very brief on this, but when we talk about Black Lives Matter and all lives matter, there are people that, right, grew up with different experiences. If you've never been pulled over by the police just for looking suspicious or being in the wrong neighborhood, then maybe your perception is, oh, that's just what people think it is. I've never had that. And it's based on their own experiences and their own expectations. While some people are out complaining about wearing a mask because they can't breathe, and others have their necks underneath a policeman's knee. I'm not going to go any farther than that on this, but you can understand that when we say perception is reality, people's realities are very different based on their own experiences and expectations. So what we know about sensation and perception is that all of our senses receive this sensory stimulation. We all receive light waves through our eyes. We all receive sound waves through our ears. Touch, pain, and temperature through our skin senses and internal organs sometimes. And taste and smell, which are chemical senses. When we say that we use specialized receptor cells, that means two things. For one, is that each of these senses has a specific pathway with a specific stimulus. So only light waves will make it through the visual system. Only sound waves will make it through the auditory system. You can't shine a flashlight in your ear and have the cells in the ear go, oh, that's light. Let's send that over. They won't do it. If you shine a flashlight on your arm, you're not going to feel touch of the light, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very specific to each specific sensation. Light will only cause the cells or sensory neurons in the eyes to send the signal to the brain. Sound will only activate in the ear. And stuff like that. When we talk about a receptor cell in this chapter, what we mean is that, remember what the receptor does is in chapter 2, it took up the neurotransmitter and changed the electrical impulse to potentially get towards or away from an action potential. Here, when we talk about a receptor cell, what we're talking about is making sure that the signal gets to the brain in a language the brain can understand. The brain, as we talked about in chapter 2, only gets action potentials and chemicals. If you were to open up your brain and shine a flashlight right onto the occipital lobe, into the visual cortex, you're still not going to get a light. The brain's not going to go, oh, that's a light, right? Because that is a language. Light waves, a physical stimulus in the environment, is not a language the brain can speak. and the brain is in charge of everything we do. So at some point, that physical stimulus, a light wave, needs to become action potentials and neurotransmitters. Sound waves need to become action potentials and neurotransmitters. It needs to be transformed or converted into a language that the brain can understand. So not only is it specific to our specific systems, light for the eyes, sound waves for the ears, etc., but it also has special cells that have to convert the information into what we call neural impulses, action potentials, and chemicals, neurotransmitters. So these sensory receptor cells transform that stimulation, those waves or those chemical senses, the physical stimuli, into a brain signal that the brain can then interpret and deliver that information to our brain. And these special cells, these special sensory receptor cells, are the ones that convert one form of physical energy, light waves, sound waves, chemicals, into another, which is the neural signal, a brain signal that the brain can understand. So when we get to the visual system in the next lecture, we'll talk about in the back of the eye, in the retina, that there are special cells called rods and cones that do just that, and I'll explain how they do it. In the auditory system, in the third lecture, I'll talk about how sound waves are then transduced, this is called transduction, transduced into an action potential, and then, of course, chemicals, neurotransmitters, in the inner ear, and the other systems as well. So all of our five senses are very specific for that sense. All of them get transduced from a physical stimulus or signal into one the brain can interpret, a neural impulse, action potentials, chemicals, right? Things like that. And then that system has to make sure that it gets to the right part of the brain. So the visual information has to go to the occipital lobe, to the visual cortex, in order for the brain to interpret what we're seeing. From the ear to the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe to understand what it is that we're hearing. Because we don't see, hear, touch, taste, or feel anything until it reaches the brain, and the brain can put those puzzle pieces together. You with me? I sure hope so. So scientists, other than looking at the brain aspect of it, have to work from a standpoint of understanding when, how, and how strong a signal must be for us to actually interpret it. How strong must a light be before our eyes can actually see it and our brain can understand that it's a light? How loud or quiet a sound, or how far away does it have to be before we can understand that it's a sound? And this gets even more complicated when we think about things like being distracted, being tired, being amidst a lot of background noise. Are you going to be able to hear that same sound if you're at a crowded party? Are you going to be able to see that same thing if it's light out or dark out? If you're tired or if you're fixated on something else? So the idea for this is we need some way to be able to predict how and when we can detect something that will cross into consciousness so that we can perceive it. And scientists and researchers and psychologists that work with this use something called signal detection theory. That theory is what predicts how and when we will detect a faint stimulus amid a lot of other things like background noise. Now, when something first hits you, right, when you first see something or hear something or taste or touch or smell something, then it crosses what we call the absolute threshold. And the absolute threshold is just that point where it goes from nothing to something. Why is it that sometimes you can feel a fly land on your arm or a leaf fall from a tree and hit your arm or something like that? But some insects, when you get bit, little mosquitoes or something like that, right, crawl on your arm and bite you, and you don't feel anything until your arm starts to itch from where they bit you, right? Smallest touch or see a light from very far away. Some people can't. So our individual absolute thresholds have a lot of different variants. They can change because, or they depend on, the strength of the signal, how bright the light is, how loud the sound is, how, how much touch there is. And it depends on things like our experiences, our expectations, our motivations, and how alert we are, right? So one of the examples I like to give when I'm in class is, let's say you're driving home from school. You're going home from school and you usually drive down, I don't know, Atlantic or Cesar Chavez or whatever it is. And you just drive pretty much the same route every day. Now, let's say that you're passing a house like halfway home, and maybe it's a new week, and over the weekend, the people who lived at this certain house put up this very beautiful rose garden. Some people, when they're driving by, will see it out of their peripheral vision, out of the corner of their eye, and right away, they will recognize it and go, wow, this family must have just put in this new rose garden, and it's lovely. But there's a lot of people who don't pay attention to these little things, flowers and such. So they'll drive right by and maybe not even ever notice, right? They're not motivated to. Maybe people who love flowers and artsy things and stuff like that would be the ones to notice, and other people just drive right by and will never notice if their life depended on it, right? If you're tired, you're not going to notice. If you have different motivations, different experiences, right? But if flowers and having a really nice front yard are of importance to you, chances are you'll see that before somebody else does. So our individual absolute thresholds vary. So we've talked about signal detection theory, and we know that everybody has different individual levels and individual thresholds. But what exactly is an absolute threshold, and how do we define it according to signal detection theory? Well, I'm glad you asked. Here we have a nice little chart that kind of shows what it is we're talking about. And yes, it is important to understand these definitions for certain exams and things like that. So the absolute threshold is defined as, and I'll bring my cursor over, the minimum amount of stimulation needed to detect a particular stimulus at least half or 50% of the time. So that means that you don't have to see it every single time it happens, but you do need to see it at least 50% of the time. So this says if you can see a far away light in the darkness, how far away does the light have to be? Or feel the softest touch, or smell something, or hear something that's kind of far away, right? And you only have to do it 50% of the time for it to cross your absolute threshold. And yes, we talked about the threshold as that imaginary line that was the all or none for the neuron in chapter 2. So you can think about that word threshold as that sort of limit to where it becomes conscious. When it goes from nothing to something, you don't see anything in the distance, and then all of a sudden you see a light, then it's crossed your absolute threshold. So what does that mean that you can detect it at least 50% of the time? Well, let's say that I'm standing 100 yards away, which is, the length of a football field, and I have a tiny flashlight, and I shine the flashlight 12 times. If you can see that light 6 of the 12 times at least, then that's 50%, and that's crossed your absolute threshold. But what about the 6 times you don't see it? Well, anything below that 50% is what we call subliminal. Sub meaning below the limit, below the threshold. So that is the input that is below the absolute threshold. And what that absolute threshold is is conscious awareness. Now, I know that we have not gone through the conscious chapter yet, but that will be the next one. So you will understand that we have a conscious and an unconscious system that our brain operates with. So things can be under the can be subliminal. They can be under the absolute threshold, and we just don't consciously sense them, or we don't consciously perceive them. Can something that we don't perceive actually make it into consciousness? The answer is yes. A lot of times we can activate unconsciously some sort of association in our minds that sets us up to perceive something, maybe remember something that we wanted to remember, or even to respond to objects or events in certain ways. People that respond with a visceral reaction to these protests or things like that may be a sensation of priming. Now, I want to give you an example of priming that I always use in class. And then I'm going to do something that will hopefully kind of catch you via priming. And you can get mad at me if you want. Hopefully you'll play along with me. But ultimately you can use it to catch other people and make yourself look clever through the magic of psychology. All right, let's get to that. So, again, priming is an unconscious, potentially, association. So I am not a person who is a connoisseur of flowers myself, but I do look at flowers regularly because I love to give my wife flowers at least once or twice a month, minimum. It makes her happy, and I like it when the boss is happy. And yes, I call my wife the boss. Get used to it. So let's just say, for example, that I was thinking early on in the week, I think it's time I got my wife some flowers. It's been a few weeks and I really want to get her some flowers. Then I go to work all week, doing a lot of stuff. Maybe I got other things going on, and I don't necessarily remember that I wanted to get my wife flowers. And then later in the week, I'm driving home down that same way home that you guys are going, and I pass that house that has all the new beautiful roses in the front. Now, I don't notice the roses are there, right? So it's not about crossing my absolute threshold to say, ooh, look at those roses. But all of a sudden, as soon as I pass that house with the roses, I get this memory in my head. Boom. I just remembered, for whatever reason, I don't know why I just remembered it just now, but I was supposed to go get my wife flowers. And so instead of heading straight home, I'm going to stop at the store and I'm going to get my wife the nicest looking roses that are there. So that idea is priming, right? I did not actually know, I didn't actually see, I didn't actually consciously perceive the flowers, but what that quick shot of the flowers in my peripheral vision did, that rose garden, is it reminded me that I was going to buy my wife flowers and I had totally forgotten. So that is the idea of priming. It's an activation that is unconscious of an association. I earlier in the week said I wanted to buy my wife flowers, and now I just remembered it because my brain kind of saw the flowers and it reminded me. I couldn't have told you that the flowers were there. I don't even know what reminded me to buy the flowers. I mean, if I wasn't a neuroscience major, right? But I wouldn't have been able to tell you at the time, until I learned about priming, that that's what did it. So let's try something now. And I don't know if you're around other people or if you're by yourself or if you ever talk to your computer, but humor me, bear with me. So if I were to ask you to do something, I would like for you to do it out loud, but obviously I can't check if you do. So I would like for you to spell the word pop. Now I would like for you to spell the word mop. And now I would like for you to spell the word hop. And I would like you to tell me out loud or tell yourself what you do when you come to a green light. Now, some of you that actually did it might have caught themselves saying, stop. Well, what I actually asked was, what do you do when you come to a green light? But your brain is already making a rhyming priming. So, well, that almost rhymed too, right? So I asked you to spell hop. I asked you to spell mop. I asked you to spell pop, words that rhyme with stop. And then I asked you to, what do you do when you come to a green light? In your brain, you've already got the OP words, op, and your brain is processing, what do you do when you come to a green light? Even though I said green light, if you're automatically processing, if you're activating that priming, your brain is more likely to say stop, even though I asked what you do at a green light. If you have the chance to think about it, then you'd say, no, at a green light, I go. But I may have just gotten you. And you may be a little upset at me until you realize, hey, you can do that to your friends and family, right? It also works if you use words that rhyme with milk. If you say spell ilk, spell silk, and then you ask what cows drink. Because cows don't drink milk, they produce it. They drink water. But you can have the same priming effect. And we'll talk about priming more in the memory chapter. So don't worry, it's not going away. So that was the absolute threshold when you ask when it goes from nothing to something, when it goes from absolutely nothing to being able to see something or hear something, smell, taste, or touch something. That is the absolute threshold. The minimum amount of stimulation it takes just to detect that something's there 50% of the time. We also have another definition called the difference threshold. This is not the same as the absolute threshold. The difference threshold sometimes is also called the just noticeable difference. And this is defined as the minimum difference a person can detect between any two stimuli at least 50% or half the time. And the difference here, besides the name, is that it also increases this threshold with the size of the stimulus. So I'll get to that in a second. So an example of the absolute threshold is, again, maybe somebody tapping you on the shoulder. And when you feel them tapping you on the shoulder, you finally turn around because you feel them tapping, then it's crossed your absolute threshold. Or if we were to do it in terms of music, to go along with the video that you'll watch after this, if you are in your car stereo, right, in your car listening to the stereo, and maybe you muted it because somebody called or you're having a conversation, you want to turn it back on or turn it back up so that you actually hear the radio. You had the radio on, but you turned it down to 0 when you muted it, or just physically turned it down to 0. So I know that my car has a volume control, and it usually has numbers. And if you're muted or if you're at the bottom, it's 0, 0, or just 0. So maybe you change it from 0 to 1, and you still hear nothing coming out of the stereo. It has not crossed your absolute threshold yet. Then maybe you move it from 1 to 2, and now you can't really make out what they're saying, but you can just hear something coming out of the radio. You hear some sort of noise from the stereo. Then it's crossed your absolute threshold. The difference threshold is when you can detect a difference in the intensity. So if it's sound, it's with that moment that you can detect that it actually got louder. Or if it's loud, the moment you can detect that it actually got a little bit quieter. That's the difference threshold. So if you change it from 0 to 1, you still hear nothing. And now you're at 2. Now you can hear something coming out of the stereo, even though you can't hear necessarily the music or whatever. It's crossed your absolute threshold. So let's say you go from 2 to 3. And when you go from the volume of 2 to 3, you hear no difference. It sounds just like it did at 2. Then it has not crossed your difference threshold. Now you go from 3 to 4, and now it sounds a little bit louder or a little bit clearer. You can tell that there's a difference. Then it has crossed your difference threshold, right? The moment you can tell that it got louder, or that a smell gets smellier, or that somebody touching you, it gets a little bit harder, right? They go from tapping you to slapping you. The moment you can tell that it's a harder stimulus or a bigger stimulus, stronger stimulus, then it's crossed your difference threshold. Now, the second half of this says it increases with stimulus size. And that's where Weber's law, or Weber's law, however you want to pronounce it, it doesn't really matter, comes into play. So what this says is, to get the difference, when you have, if your stereo is already up at 20, right, instead of at 2, and it's already pretty loud, it takes more volume for you to tell that it got louder or quieter, right? It takes more stimulus. And what Weber's law says is that for an average person to be able to perceive this difference, two stimuli must differ by a constant minimum percentage and not a constant amount. The exact proportion varies depending on the stimulus. So what this means is, we don't want to look at it as if, since I wanted to use volume because it has numbers, and sometimes it's easier for people to understand numbers. So when you go from 0 to 1 to 2, and now you hear something, and when you go from 2 to 3, you don't hear a change. But when you go from 2 to 4, then you get a change, right? That's your difference threshold here. Stay with me. So that 2 to 4 is an increase of 2. But what Weber's law says is it's not a constant amount, it's a constant percentage. So the difference between a volume of 2 and a volume of 4 isn't just, right? If it was an amount, it would be a volume of 2. 2 plus 2 is 4. But it's a percentage. So what you're doing when you're going from volume of 2 to volume of 4 is you're doubling the volume. So if we're looking at percentage, that's like a 200% increase, right? Or a 100% increase because you're doubling it, right? So what that means is that the difference between a volume of 2 and 4 is 2, but it's doubled. So if you were to go from a volume of 20 to a volume of 22 and increase it by 2, you're not going to get the same effect as going from 2 to 4. Because it's a constant percentage and you're doubling it, right? You're going that the difference between a volume of 2 and 4 is the same as the difference in volume between 20 and 40. It's a minimum percentage, not a constant amount. So when I'm in class, what I like to do is I have 2 envelopes in my hand, and hopefully you can just picture this. I have 2 envelopes in my hand. One has 2 quarters in it, and one has 3 quarters in it, and this is about weight. So I ask a volunteer from the class to come up and say, can you tell the difference? Close your eyes, and I put one envelope with 2 coins in one of their hands, and I put the envelope with 3 quarters in the other hand. And I ask them to feel the weight of each, right? This is on the touch system because you're feeling the weight of it on your fingers, on your skin. And I say, can you tell me which one feels heavier? And pretty much every time, I think every time so far in my years of teaching this, I don't think anyone's got it wrong. You can feel the difference between 2 quarters and 3 quarters in the weight of an envelope, which is basically almost weightless. So yes, it is pretty easy to tell the difference between 2 quarters and 3 quarters in an envelope. Then I ask for 2 textbooks, and our textbooks are pretty heavy. So I put one of the envelopes in a textbook, and I put the other envelope in a different textbook, and then I give the person both textbooks to hold in their hands. And I say, now, can you tell which one is heavier? And they say, no, I can't. Because in a very heavy book, it's really hard to tell the difference between 2 and 3 quarters. In an envelope, which weighs almost nothing, it's fairly easy to tell the difference between the weight of 2 and the weight of 3 quarters. So it's not the amount, because the amount didn't change there. It was still the weight of 2 quarters versus the weight of 3, but it was the proportion that varied. This increases with stimulus size. If I wanted to tell the difference in a heavy textbook, I would probably have to go with the difference between like 20 quarters and 30 quarters, maybe. Maybe that we could tell the difference, or even more than that. The heavier the books, the more quarter difference we'd need to tell. So that's what Weber's law is saying. And the difference threshold is when it crosses and you feel something get heavier, or you hear it get louder, or you see it get brighter or dimmer. When you can detect a difference, that first time you can detect a difference, it's crossed your difference threshold. So when we talk about going back to this idea of subliminal, right? Subliminal means below the conscious threshold, below the absolute threshold. So 50% of the time, according to that absolute threshold definition, these are too weak to detect up to half the time. But does that mean that we can't, just because we don't perceive them, just because they're not conscious, doesn't mean that they don't exist, and it doesn't mean that too quick and we don't put any attention to them to make them conscious to enable any sort of exploitation or interaction with these messages or these things. I didn't see the rose garden, but I did all of a sudden get primed for a memory that I was going to buy my wife flowers. So it definitely had some effect. So these sensations are a fact. We just don't necessarily consciously see them, interpret them. And so we can be persuaded by them. We can be primed, so to speak. It can remind me that I was going to buy flowers for my wife. Now, had I never had any thought about buying flowers for anyone or anything like that, I probably just would have driven past and it would have been like any other day. But the fact that it combined with something that I was thinking about in the same ballpark, right? Flowers, it combined to cause me to remember that. So what we know is that you can have what we call subliminal persuasion. It may produce a fleeting and subtle, not very powerful, but it may have an enduring effect on our behavior. This was a study shown by a researcher named Greenwald in 1992. And if that is the case, and advertisers wanted to run with this, in the 80s and especially through the mid 90s, there were several attempts at what we call subliminal advertising. Because, right, advertisers like Taco Bell, for example, pay a lot of money to have commercials. And if you do it during the Super Bowl, it's even more money to pay for people to watch these commercials. But executives and advertisers thought, well, what if we could do it without having a commercial? So let's just say that Taco Bell wanted to advertise during a movie, but instead of waiting for a commercial break, they said, why don't we take advantage of this subliminal persuasion? And maybe while you're watching a movie, at the very bottom of the screen, or maybe right in the center of the screen, for less than half a second, they flash the words Taco Bell across the screen. The hope is that all of a sudden you're watching this movie and you go, man, I'm hungry and I could really make a run for the border. All of a sudden, for some reason, I want Taco Bell, right? But it didn't work so well that way. With priming, what they found is that it could produce an effect if you were already hungry and you already were in the mood for tacos or whatever an enchilada is, right? So if you were already hungry, it's 11:30 at night, you're watching some movie on TV, and you're already hungry and thinking about it, but you don't really want to go anywhere, so you're just watching the movie, and then all of a sudden, boom, your eyes get that Taco Bell flash on the screen. Consciously, you don't interpret it, right? Because it's subliminal, but it could make you say, "Oh, I could really make a run for the board. I could really go to Taco Bell right now." If you're not hungry or you're not thinking about tacos, most of the time it's not going to do anything for you. Just like driving past the roses wouldn't do anything for me if I wasn't already thinking about buying my wife flowers, right? So experiments discounted attempts at subliminal advertising and self-improvement. And here is a point where I'd ask in class, does anybody know the two most common types of self-improvement that were sold in the late 80s and early 90s that were attempts at self-improvement? And because I can't wait for an answer for you guys, because this is a solo recording, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you. The first one was learn a language. And this was when they talked about subliminal self-improvement, it was to do it while you were sleeping. So the hope was that you could put these tapes on in your Walkman or Discman or whatever. And now we could talk about your MP3 player or iPods or whatever. And you'd play it while you were sleeping, and it would help you to learn while you slept because you weren't conscious, you weren't awake. So the two biggest ones that were the biggest sellers that didn't necessarily work, but they were the biggest sellers back then, were learning a new language. So there was a lot of learn a language while you sleep. Put these earbuds or headphones on, and while you sleep, you'll learn Spanish, French, Italian, whatever, while you sleep. And the second biggest one, weight loss. So while you're sleeping, maybe you get messages whispered into your ears of think thin, or you don't want to eat that, or don't go to Taco Bell. So that Taco Bell subliminal advertising might be combating with your weight loss tape at the same time, right? Okay. Now I'm just kidding. I don't apologize for my bad jokes. So weight loss and learning a language were the two biggest sellers of self-improvement while you sleep. They didn't really work the way that people hoped they would, and so that's why you don't see them around these days, just to let you know. So moving on with this idea of sensation and perception is not just the fact that we have absolute thresholds, difference thresholds, and the difference between sensation and perception, but also that in order to be able to navigate our world in a useful way, we also need to be able to adapt to our surroundings. That was sort of the idea behind Darwin's theories, right? Survival of the fittest. If you had, and again, I sort of touched upon this in the prologue with the sense of fear. If you didn't have a sense of fear, your ancestors back in the day, and you weren't scared of saber-toothed tigers, chances are you'd get eaten and you would die. And then your family heritage would not live on. So in that way, not with saber-toothed tigers and our ancestors, but our sensory systems had to find a way to adapt to prolonged exposure, constant stimulation. And that idea is sensory adaptation. Just like I said, congratulations, you're all here because your ancestors had the genetics to survive. So here we are for you to take this class. Sensory adaptation is defined as a diminished sensitivity or decreased sensitivity as a consequence of constant stimulation. So what does that mean? Because that sounds like a big wordy sentence or phrase. Well, think about this. When you first wake up in the morning, right, if you don't have any shades on the windows or anything like that, it can get really, really bright. I know that I am not a morning person. And so for me, I would rather, even if it's bright outside, I'd rather not put any lights on in the house and let myself wake up naturally. My wife is a morning person. So a lot of times, first thing she does, especially if she had to get up early and go to work, sometimes before the sun even came up or as it was coming up, turns the lights on in the bathroom, lights on in the bedroom, lights on everywhere. And of course me, I'm like a vampire, like, turn them off, right? So anytime you wake up in the morning and it's really bright, or if the lights come on and it gets really bright, after about 30 seconds to a minute, you realize that your eyesight adjusts. And it works the other way too. If you're in a really, you come from a really light place and into a dark movie theater or something like that, eventually after about a minute or so, your vision adjusts. If you walk into a party and it's really loud, hopefully you guys remember parties. After about a minute or so, you get used to the background noise, and you might be able to hear somebody calling your name or individual conversations even. Um, when you're sitting down in a chair and maybe you're sitting at a desk in school and it's kind of uncomfortable, after about a minute or two, you barely even notice that you're sitting there, right? Until you, maybe if you move around and stuff like that. But this works for all five senses. And what it does is it aids our focus by reducing the background noise, background chatter, and it influences how the world is perceived in a personally useful way. Think about what would happen in your life if you walked out of a movie theater, walked out of class where I have all the lights off because I have the, slides going like these. And then you walk out into, let's say class is over at noon and you walk out to a really bright day. You don't have sunglasses and your eyes can't adjust to the amount of sunlight. Well, then you're squinting and you're probably walking into people or buildings. And you know what? Good luck driving home, right? So sensory adaptation allows us to see the world and perceive it in a personally useful way. It tones down things. We can get used to our sitting. We can get used to the amount of light. We can get used to smells, right? Sometimes you may be living in a place. I have a dog, right? There may be people that walk into my house that don't own dogs and they walk in and they go, whoa, what is that smell? And you're like, what smell? What are you talking about? Right? Because you're used to it. I think, was it Febreze uses the term nose blind? You're nose blind to it, right? You don't smell it because you're constantly exposed to it. And now that we're staying at home, right, I'm around it all the time. So if somebody were to come to the door, they might say, oh man, it smells like dog in here. And I'd be like, what are you talking about? So not only does this influence, this idea called sensory adaptation, influence our five senses, but it also influences our emotions. Our emotions and the emotions we can see from other people. So let me give you an example of this. Here is an example from the book based on a study in 2008. And if you wanted to do this, you could pause I'm not going to hold the video up, but you could either do it from the book or you could pause the video here and look at the faces on either the left or right for about 20 to 30 seconds. I suggest 30 seconds. And then you look at the one in the center. So on the left, you see this is the same woman in three different photos. On the left, she looks angry. She's making an angry face. On the right, she looks scared. She's making a scared face. And the picture in the middle is actually one that is a 50-50 composite of those two. So she's half scared, half angry, right? She's kind of in between those two pictures. If you were to focus on the one on the left where she's angry for 20 to 30 seconds, again, closer to 30, and then looked at the one in the middle, she would look the opposite. So from angry, she would look scared in the middle. If you concentrated on the right on the scared face for 30 seconds and then looked in the middle, she would look angry. And you can test this out if you want. I would use the book as opposed to using a screen because it works better this way. But either way, it should work. And that shows you that even when we read the interpretations, the emotions on people's faces, we have that sensory adaptation to help guide us. So when we are talking about all these things that we sense and perceive, right? It also means that people have different perceptions of things. People have different bases, different experiences, different expectations. A lot of times you just say a word. Like for me, I'm a very big sports fan, so I'm missing sports a lot. But because I'm a sports fan, it means I have teams I absolutely love, and the rivals of those teams are teams that I don't like to use the word hate, but from a sports sense, maybe it's okay, right? As a Laker fan, anytime somebody even says the word Celtics, I just get this ugh feeling, right? Because I just can't stand them, big rivals, all of that stuff. So just hearing the Celtics are playing, like, ugh, right? So we have these mental tendencies. And what do people base them on, whether it's conscious or unconscious? We have what we call these perceptual sets. These perceptual sets are defined as mental tendencies and assumptions that affect our top-down processing. It affects what we hear, taste, feel, and see. It is why some people see a dog and they go, oh, that's a doggy, I love dogs. And some people see a dog and they go, whatever. And then other people see a dog and they go, I got to get away from that dog. It's based on their perceptual sets. Now, of course, we have perceptual sets based on experiences and based on expectations, maybe based on stories that our parents told us, but we also have perceptual sets determined by things that we've never experienced in our life, but maybe we've read it in a book, maybe we heard it in a story, maybe we saw it in a movie or a TV show. And even though we don't have an actual experience of it, we can have a perceptual set. So and they even organize and interpret unfamiliar information through a different type of experience, like watching a movie. So, um, as you see here, it says that these pre-existing schemas influence our top-down processing of ambiguous sensation interpretation, including things like race and gender stereotypes. So I'll get to that in a second. But schemas, even though you've never done something before, you still have sort of a mental picture of it. So I like to use the example of either outer space or a bank robbery. And normally when I'm in class, I ask the question, have you ever been in a bank robbery? If you've ever been in a bank robbery, please, I'm not an insensitive person, but just the answer to that has always been nobody's ever been part of a bank robbery. So hopefully that's still the case. I can't really ask you here. But if I were to tell you to close your eyes and picture a bank robbery, even though you've never been in one in person, you've probably seen them in a movie or a TV show. You've probably read about them maybe in a fictional book or something like that. So if I were to ask you to close your eyes and think about what it would look like or feel like or what you would do in a bank robbery, you probably have some sort of mental representation of maybe people wearing, bandanas over their faces or ski masks, or if you really like the Dark Knight series of movies, Joker and those clown masks, right, from the first scene of the Dark Knight, because that's what I think of now. And you would think about, maybe hearing, this is a stick up, hands in the air, or everybody on the ground, or something like that, right? And so you have some sort of mental representation. Hardly anybody's ever been to outer space, but we've seen it on TV in space launches, some more recent than others. We've seen it in a lot of movies. So even though you've never been to outer space, you have some sort of mental representation of what it would be like. Zero gravity, in a rocket ship, wearing that space suit, right? Things like that. Maybe even eating astronaut ice cream if you've been to the Science Center recently. So even things that we've never done or experienced before, we can have some sort of schema for. So therefore, we can have a perception of it, even though we've never done it. This is where gender stereotypes come in, because people hear about women are more wordy, men are better with directions. We hear about all of these things. Of course, as I said in the first lecture, that the interesting thing about gender psychology is that we're more alike than we are different. However, we still get a lot of things like this. I had never until recently heard of something called a pink tax. And actually, I was on social media last night. And one of my friends, who's also a psychologist, she showed me a Leapfrog, which is a tablet for little children that she was looking to get for her 4-year-old. Now, Leapfrog is a company that most everything is in green and white, like a frog. And when you buy things, right, they sometimes come in different colors and things like that. So she was on Amazon and she took a screenshot of it and showed that the regular Leapfrog keyboard was like $16.29 or something like that. And the same exact keyboard in pink and white, as opposed to green and white, was $3 more. And she said, I would never do this, but this is ridiculous. And it made me laugh out loud. And it also made me angry, right? So we see that that may reflect the price range of things. Somebody who's never been in quote unquote the wrong neighborhood, right? A white person that has never been pulled over for no reason, never been pulled over for looking suspicious by wearing a hoodie, they may not ever understand why people say that. Oh, well, they must have done something wrong. If you don't do something wrong, you'll never get arrested, or you'll never get pulled over, or things like that, because that's what their schema determines. I did nothing wrong. I can just blah, 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 walk right in. I can just walk through these neighborhoods. I can, nobody's going to call the police on me for that. I'm not going to get pulled over for just driving for no reason. So there's a lot of this that's in there, and part of what we have to do is sort of break that up. But again, I'm getting a little preachy. So the last thing that I really wanted to get into before the next lecture is that sometimes, based on our schemas, based on our perceptions, our expectations, motivations, and things like that, we may see things different. And culturally, that may also be the case. So one of the things I wanted to point out is that one of the main differences that we've seen over the years between Western cultures and Eastern cultures, meaning Western hemisphere side of the world and Eastern side of the world, like Asia, and countries like that, Africa, Australia, right, is that when on the Western side of the world, we tend to look at a picture and see the foreground first. So don't read what's under here yet, but looking at the picture itself, we see an African family, and a dog, and then in the background, they're sitting on some stuff, and there's some stuff in the background, right? On the Eastern side of the world, they tend to see the background first before they perceive what's in the foreground. So somebody in East Africa or in Asia or something like that may see what's going on in the background before they look and concentrate their gaze, their vision at the people and the dog. So what it says on here on the right is that a given stimulus may trigger different perceptions simply because of the immediate context. So here we see a family. Some are standing, most are sitting. And the question here is, are they inside or outside? Specifically, they ask what's above the woman's head. So I'm going to tell you the answer based on what I would say and based on what most of my classes have said. Based on the information given in this picture, it looks like they are sitting inside a house or a place like that, because we see the people first. And then after that, we see over the woman's head, it looks to be a window of some sort, right? So maybe it's a white wall and there's a window, and even outside the window, you can see like maybe a tree and some sky. And then if that's a window, then that thing in the back is sort of looks like a pillar or a column that's kind of holding up the roof and the walls. When they asked this same question to people that lived in East Africa on the Eastern Hemisphere, who were questioned, they said the woman was balancing some sort of metal box or can of some sort on her head, and that the family was actually sitting under a tree. So that thing behind them wasn't a column or it wasn't a pillar, it was actually the base or trunk of a tree. Now, you don't actually see any walls. Those are ambiguous, right? So this is based on schematics. Westerners tended to say that they're sitting inside and that thing was holding up the roof and there were walls there. In East Africa, they said that saw the background first and said that's some sort of box on her head, not a window. There's no actual walls back there, and they're sitting under a tree outside. So, once again, I say perception is reality. Whatever you think based on the context there, based on your schemas, based on your perceptions, your attributions, your experiences, motivations, right? Memories, expectations, that is what you see. So your perception is your reality. And I will talk to you guys very, very soon.